What's up, headbangers? Welcome back to the heaviest show in the universe. Today, we are diving into the history of the best, most brutal, most diverse genre of metal, death metal. Let's get into it. So of course we can't talk about evil, satanic, or brutal metal without first starting off with the roots of all of this. Where did this imagery come from? Where did the speed of this music come from? Where did the heaviness of this music come from? And in order to do that, we need to talk about Venom. These guys laid the groundwork for all brutality that would come after. When we talk about thrash metal, which is the father of all extreme metal, we have to first talk about Venom, because Venom was really producing this speed, this heaviness that other bands weren't producing at the time. And you can say Motorhead had an influence on that as well, and you would be right, but Venom was really pushing the boundaries even more than Motorhead was, because Motorhead was more punky and was way more in the new wave of British heavy metal, while Venom was doing its own thing, producing extreme music, or what would later become extreme music. And of course, their first two albums, Welcome to Hell and Black Metal, are widely regarded as the very first in this line of satanic imagery. You know, the goat's head and the song called Black Metal and the pentagrams with the goat head in the middle. All of that started with Venom. They pioneered this black evil imagery. Venom were true pioneers of this heavy, darker music, and we wouldn't even be able to talk about any of this today if it weren't for these badasses really getting it started, not giving a damn in hell in 1978. So now we get into extreme metal, like the real extreme metal, and that was thrash. Thrash birthed extreme metal. And what bands were doing in 1983, bands like Metallica, were taking metal and pushing it to its extreme, hence the name. All those thrash bands, they started playing faster, they started playing heavier, they started incorporating palm mutes way more than all of those new wave of British heavy metal bands, which were playing higher music. They were playing higher on the fretboard. They were playing more upbeat music than a lot of these thrash bands would start playing. If you can, guess not, but the needle's better, grandma. Oh yeah. All the crazy chugga music that you hear in today's metalcore scene and the modern metal scene, it all started with thrash back in the early days. And we're talking about pioneering death metal. There was one band in the thrash scene above all else that really laid the groundwork for what death metal was going to become. And of course, that band was Slayer. And if you haven't heard my argument yet about how Rain in Blood was the first death metal album, I'll link that up here and you can go check it out now. But if we want to talk about influencing death metal, then we can go as early as Hell Awaits on their album list to see the death metal influence in their sound. These guys were pioneering that heavy, brutal, fast sound that death metal would become way as early as 1984 and 85. Of course, I would be remiss not to mention the fantastic album Seven Churches by Possessed, which is often but wrongly considered as the first death metal album. That album came out in 1984, and while it is fantastic, it's brutal, it's fast, it's awesome, and it has a lot of death metal elements to its sound, it's not as close to death metal as Rain in Blood would become a year later. Possessed also released a demo in 1983 called Death Metal, but this is pure coincidence. They weren't pushing the boundaries and creating what would later be called death metal in their sound. It was a thrash metal sound, and Seven Churches is an overwhelmingly thrash metal sound as well. But they were laying the groundwork. Along with creator and Slayer, Possessed, these guys were laying the groundwork for music to really become more heavy and more brutal and faster and darker. Pleasure to Kill is also highly regarded as a huge influence on the death metal scene, and creator deserves full props for taking thrash to its extreme as well with Slayer and Possessed. And of course, you had Chuck Schuldiner with his first project, Mantis, in 1984, releasing the demo Death by Metal, which had the song Evil Dead on it, which would eventually come out on Death's first full-length release, Scream Bloody Gore. So the argument can be made that that might be the origins of death metal, but it was too primitive, it wasn't around long enough, and it wasn't as big to influence as many people as Rain in Blood or Pleasure to Kill or even Seven Churches. But Chuck was really just getting his bearings with Mantis at the time, and there were lineup changes, and he was trying to get things ready before 1987 when Scream Bloody Gore would eventually come out. 'That takes us to the true birth of death metal in 1987. Chuck Schuldiner and Death really saw to it that this baby was shooting out in 1987. It was here, and it was here to stay, and it was coming out in full force. Like, just look at some of these albums that came out in this time frame of 1987 to 1989. You've got Scream Bloody Gore and Leprosy from Death alone, two absolute classic bangers. Bands like Necrophagia releasing Seasons of the Dead. Morbid Angel was releasing multiple demos before their masterpiece climactic album Altars of Madness came out in 1989 and really put everyone else on notice, like, this is death metal, this is the pinnacle of death metal. It even put Chuck and Death on notice. 1989 was the true breakout year for death metal. Like I said before, you had Altars of Madness by Morbid Angel, which is an absolute classic, one of the greatest metal albums of all time, and one of the greatest debut albums of all time. For a band to come out like this full force on their first album is absolutely insane. This inspired metal for generations to come. You also had Autopsy's first album, Severed Survival, which is a classic. You had Pestilence releasing their debut album, and you had Bolt Thrower releasing their first album, and Carcass as well coming into the death metal scene and leaving the grindcore area as well. Betraying Atheist had their debut albums in 1989 as well, flipping metal on its head, and Cannibal Corpse's first demo came out in 1989 as well. It was at this time the death metal sound was really nailed down to that slowly trotting rot of the guitars and the drums. And of course the vocals. Everyone kind of had the same vocal pattern except for Chuck, who really sung at a higher range. He was more shrieking and everyone else was more guttural or shouting or growling. It was a real primitive time for death metal. These bands didn't get a lot of funding right off the bat, so the production quality was a bit lower, but that never bothered anyone at the time. They were used to listening to tapes from around the world that were ripped 5 times over and you could barely make out the guitars from the drums, and let alone the bass. That wasn't happening at all. It was a total backlash against what Napalm Death and early Carcass were doing over in the UK with grindcore. Of course, death metal was fast, but grindcore was taking it to a whole nother level, and death metal wanted to bring it back. Death metal wanted to bring it back to that thrash sound, the more intricate guitar playing, but taken to the next level. A lot of heavier drum and bass, a lot more emphasis on vocals. Death metal was slowly killing off the underground of thrash and becoming the new whole metal underground in itself. And major record labels like Earache, Metal Blade, and Roadrunner, which was starting up, were grabbing these death metal bands up by the dozens, trying to get as many as they can, thinking this is going to be the new thrash. Who's going to be the new Metallica, Megadeth, Slayer, and Anthrax that we can make tons of coin off of? This was really the birth of death metal, nailing down the sound, nailing down who the bands were going to be, and continuing forward.
This next song is about shooting blood out of your cock. I come blue.
have the rise of death metal, the rise in popularity of death metal. Now, of course, death metal never became mainstream per se, but it got pretty damn big, especially after Cannibal Corpse came out. Cannibal Corpse was so popular, they made an appearance in Ace Ventura, as everyone knows. And also the Florida death metal scene was really starting to take root. And the reason for this Florida death metal scene bubbling up was because of Morris Sound Studios in Tampa. All these crazy death metal bands were recording in Morris Sound Studios. Morbid Angel and Death and Deicide and Cannibal Corpse and Atheist, all of these bands recording at Morris Sound Studios, creating a sound that every other death metal band was going to follow by. But really, the big four bands of death metal, everyone loves to do big four of X metal because it's cool. I don't know why us metalheads love to make a big four of whatever metal genre, but it's tons of fun. The big four of this whole death metal scene, not just Florida, were Death, Deicide, Obituary, and Morbid Angel. These guys were always ahead of the curve of everyone else, always releasing classic albums. And of course, you had Cannibal Corpse coming after those bands, releasing their first album in 1990. But those four were the real big giants of that death metal scene of 1987 to 1992. And Cannibal Corpse would later take the place of a band like Obituary or Deicide after their release of Tomb of the Mutilated, and they came up in popularity. But from 1987 to 92, it was those four bands really setting the pace for everyone else to come. Around this time as well, you had Napalm Death and Carcass, as I mentioned before, coming into more death metal sound, leaving grindcore behind. There was more to be had in death metal. There was more variety, there was more structure to the songs, there was more you could do with the music than you could with grindcore. And around this time as well, you had death metal branching out, creating more subgenres like melodic death metal in Sweden and tech death in the United States. But this was really the start of death metal. This was the early history. This is where the sound came from. This is how the sound was developed. This is how the sound was able to have its roots put down so it could branch out into these other vast subgenres later on in the history. Of course, this all came to a head in September 1990 with the very first death metal festival, Day of Death. This featured about 26 different death metal bands like Autopsy and Atheist and Cynic. Now death metal had its very own festival, and it was going to start branching out and creating all sorts of different music and incorporating jazz and incorporating Swedish influences as well. And this was all to come in the future. And don't worry, we are going to get to all of those vast subgenres in another video. Headbangers, thank you so much for watching today's part 1 on the history of death metal. I hope you learned something, and if I left something out, let me know in the comments below. Did I miss something major, something pivotal in the history of death metal? I'd love to hear it down below so I don't miss it again next time. If you enjoyed the video, go down below and give me one of these bad boys. Smash that subscribe button, hit the notification bell so you never miss a video, and I will see you next week on the heaviest show in the universe. Long live metal.